Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started on with the book, and we're talking about Newell's Journal. For those of you who were here 2 years ago, you heard Dr. Mackey come and talk about the journal. We were waiting for it to get published. It got published last fall, and so you may have had a chance to read through it. How many of you have had a chance to get through it all? It's kind of hard, huh? There's a few that have. It's difficult to begin with. I just wanted to explain a little bit, kind of going back. My first experience with Newell's Journal was back, although I'm seeing a lot of people that are older than me here, so that's exciting. But when I was at BYU as a student, I had this wonderful, amazing professor called Dr. Larry Porter. That name probably sounds familiar to some of you. I didn't know who he was at the time, but I took an early church history class, and he was my teacher, my professor, and he challenged us to do a research project. And I happened to be taking English 110 at the same time, where I had to do a research project. So I thought, I'm going to do the same paper for both and just make it easier. So I chose to do mine on the knights in the early church history, which I, at that time, didn't know a lot about. I knew the names, a few stories, but not a lot. So I chose to do my research paper on the knights in the early church history. And Dr. Porter told me that there was this amazing book hidden away in the special collections of the BYU library that was Newell Knight's journals. And I was pretty surprised. So I decided I gotta go take a look at this. So I went down, and if any of you have seen those journals, you know the writing is really hard to read. It's a lot of cursive. In the front of the book, there was a page that kind of showed what that looked like. And they don't, when I went, there weren't such things as digital devices. There was no such thing as computers or tablets or phones or anything. So I took my notebook and a pencil and started copying down parts of Newell Knight's journal. And that was tedious. I had a hard time getting through. And I was a little bit miffed, if you will, at Newell for not recording important things like the organization of the church. If you've read his journal, there is one line: the church was organized and we were there, kind of thing. And then, so I copied down a few things, but it was so difficult for me that I just started going and talking to people who knew about this. And Dr. Porter became one of my great resources. And for those of you who have come to early family reunions, you know that Dr. Porter has come several times to talk to us because he did know a lot about the Newell and Joseph Knight stories. And he told me stories that I had never heard before and had forgotten since, until I read Newell's journal again that was published. So that's kind of my introduction into Newell Knight's journals. Several years ago at a night reunion, we ended up getting these blue books. They had these available, and it was pretty thick, and so I got this. And this was the Allen version of the Newell Knight Journal. And some of you might recognize that. And I had read through that. Again, that was really difficult. If you look at the writing, you can see it, it's very, very small. And there was a lot of information. So I was really grateful when this book came out. Now, for this book, Dr. Mackey and Bill Hartley, who we're going to miss more than we realize at this point, but they went through and they actually had 4 different versions of Newell's journals that we were working on, that they compiled all of the information from all 4 of those versions. The first version that we have was his original journal, and that is the one that is located at BYU. Lydia carried that across the plains, and she actually brought that journal and donated it to the church history in about 1880 or around there. She donated that to the church, and it is in the archives of the church. and that was the version 1. It's very incomplete because there were a lot of things that Newell had said he was going to include that were different documents that he stuck in or planned to stick in and maybe never got put in or were taken out because they weren't part of the original journal. We're not sure exactly what happened. But there were, that was version 1. Versions 2 and 3 are additional journals. And at first people get worked up about that, but how many of you only have one journal? Nobody. We keep notes on different ones. And Newell was exactly the same way. He kept journals in different places. He told, some of them are recordings that other people recorded of stories that Newell had told them or things that he had done. Those were all compiled. So that's what versions 2 and 3 are other journals that maybe were given to somebody else or written by somebody else, quoting Newell's stories type thing. And then version 4 is what is known as the Allen version. And it has a really cool story behind it from the version 4. It's the most comprehensive because all of those letters and papers and notes and journals were all included in as part of that. But their version 4 actually had 2,347 pages tied together with small, like in bundles. So he had included a lot of that information in, and that's what the blue book is all of those notes and letters. And as I read through there are a lot of notes included in there that were not included in the Newell's journal when it's published. And a lot of that, it appears like Newell may have been a recorder of sorts during the Nauvoo time, because there's a lot of notes recorded in there that were kept on city council meetings and on high council meetings, where it's a lot of notes on that, and that's included in the Allen version. And they've just highlighted those in the footnotes when Dr. Mackey did this book. So nobody knew about those for a long, long time. And for those of you who live in Utah and maybe have seen the Night Block in Provo, there's a business in there called Allen's Camera. And they are descendants of Newel Knight through Lydia and his line through Jesse. And when they opened up that photography business, they went down to the basement. One of the employees went down to the basement to get some equipment that maybe was stored down there, and he brought this box back, this tin box. And in that tin box were all of these papers that were all tied together in these bundles. And that's how they kind of came to light for the Allen version of that. And so that's why it's called the tin box version or the Allen version. And that most of those have been referenced in the footnotes. So those are the 4 different versions that were all used. There was a lot of research put in to take and put these journals together. Now on here, I don't know if you guys noticed this, but Newell was a poet. And you can see that in some of his writings. As I've been reading through this, I would stop and read something to my husband and say, can you believe how he put these words? Because he can come across really strong in a very poetic way when he is recording words, and when he gets upset about something or when he gets frustrated with something, he has a very nice way of putting it in a very poetic form so that you knew that he was not happy, but it was a very nice way to put it, I guess. So how many of you found some of those little nuggets in the book as you read it? Anybody? Okay, Karen, go ahead and share with us what you, turn on your audio and share with us which one you liked.
Well, I wasn't thinking of the poems, but I was just thinking of the story of the red handkerchief. It just cracked me up. Do you remember that story?
I do, but share with us.
So a lot of the saints were suffering from what they called the ague, and I think or the ague, and I think it was malaria, because they were living in swampy conditions in Nauvoo, and so they would get periodically quite ill, and they would often ask Joseph to give them blessings, Joseph Smith, the prophet, and he couldn't be everywhere at the same time, and sometimes he was gone and people wanted a blessing, and so he supposedly blessed a red handkerchief that would kind of substitute if he couldn't be there in person. So I think the story went that Lydia was feeling very sick. She asked Newell to get the handkerchief so that he could give her a blessing. And he brought a red handkerchief, but it wasn't the right one. And she caught him on it. She said, "This isn't the right one." And so anyway, I guess that red handkerchief is in the archives of the church. They had it at the museum for a while. Is that correct?
I am not absolutely sure.
Someone told me that. So, but anyway, I thought that was a funny story because as I'm reading the history of the saints written by the church, the second volume, they're talking about a handkerchief too in that situation. So, but it was just funny how Lydia figured out it was the wrong handkerchief. Somehow it wasn't the right one. Anyway, I thought that was a funny story.
That is. So it is on page 125 is kind of where it starts. And I love that story too. If you go to the YouTube, to the nighttime stories, one of the Mangum grandchildren tells that story. It's really cute how they do it. But it is. Newell didn't want to go bother the prophet, so he just brought one of his handkerchiefs. She had sent him to go to the prophet and said, if you go and ask the prophet to send one of his handkerchiefs, then I'll get better. And Newell didn't want to bother the prophet, so he just went and got a handkerchief and brought it, and she wasn't getting better. And she figured it out. Newell figured it out, and I love how he put it. Oh, sorry. I turned one page too many. And I loved his testimony after it. He had said, I felt that I had not done right in neglecting to go to the prophet as she had requested, although I had not told her the handkerchief I gave her was not from him. I left her, went immediately to the prophet, and requested him to send her his handkerchief with a word of consolation and a healing blessing. And so he finally did when she wasn't getting better, and she figured that out. It was several days later, and she kept getting worse and worse, and then figured it out. But I love his testimony of that, and this was kind of one of those things where he talked about that, shared his testimony in a simple way. He said, I laid the handkerchief upon her head and prayed the blessing to be sealed upon her. From her calm appearance, it was evident that there was a change in her feelings. She soon fell asleep and rested well during the night. In the morning, she said she had felt no pain during the night. The moment I laid the handkerchief upon her head, the pain ceased, and she did not feel as if there were any disease about her at this time. Yet she was weak. The next day, the doctor came to see her and looked at her and examined her pulse and tongue and said he had never seen so great an alteration in a patient in his life. So I thought that was a great testimony of, and hopefully that was a learning lesson that we can all learn from Newell. Lydia had the faith. Right? Yeah, Lydia had the faith. And she knew that if she got that handkerchief from the prophet, she would be healed. And Newell just wasn't quite there yet. And it took him a little bit of learning to realize that through small and simple things, miracles can happen. So thanks for sharing that, Karen. Okay, who else saw some of that poetic, fun stuff in there or saw Newell's personality come out that wants to share a story?
I remember one. This is Shura.
Okay.
There was one where they had left Nauvoo and they were on the way. They had gone towards they were still, I think, planning to cross the mountains, but later they had to stop. Somebody came to their camp and asked for volunteers to go to California, and he was like, his basic attitude was like, I can't even believe that they had the gall to come. We had to leave because the government wasn't protecting us, and the government wants us to go and fight for the government. They're crazy. Like, but he was like, there were some volunteers, and I was really surprised, you know. But I thought that was funny. Like he just was like, I mean, it doesn't say whether or not he wanted to volunteer, but you could tell he was no way he was going to volunteer for that.
Okay, thanks, Sherry. That was when they came looking for people for the Mormon battalion, and
Yeah.
Newell was like, "Are you kidding me?" and I can totally relate to that, because I have that attitude a lot of times of, really, they had the nerve to do that. But I also like how he later on said, the prophet said this is what we were supposed to do, and so regardless of how we feel or think about the government, we need to follow the prophet. And I love that it took him a minute, and I love to see that personality come out, because that's exactly what I think of a lot is, what? But to see that. Okay, anybody else have a favorite story, maybe even out of the book? Okay, I have a couple. So I went through and just read it to get the information, and then I went back through and started highlighting in some of I highlighted it in red, and I know it kind of fades out, so you can't see it as well. I fade out, but I went back through and highlighted every time Newell had that change of heart or talked about, I want my children to know this, because I felt like he was talking to us. And there were just so many times when he said, I am writing this because I want my children and my grandchildren to know this. This was not easy for us. This was difficult. Being one of the first members of the church was not easy at all, but we did it. And this is why we did it. And he said that many, many times throughout. And so I just highlighted all of that, and I ended up finding myself highlighting a lot of red of, he wrote this for us. This book was written so that we could know things. I wanted to start right at the beginning. I loved when he was, I'm trying to find it. Okay, this was when they were still in Colesville, and it was when they were going to get baptized, and they had the stream all dammed up, and then people came and broke it apart, and then Joseph Smith was arrested and sent to trial. And I love that Newell recorded the responses during the trial. So if you didn't catch that, this is the first time I caught some of his personality coming out. As he talks about the trial, and he actually tells us the question and answers. So I'm on page 14 is where I'm starting, if you wanted to turn there. And he says, and another thing that kind of makes it a little bit difficult is sometimes Newell will write in third person, and sometimes he writes in first person. And sometimes he quotes what happened to other people saying I. So just be aware of that, and that's kind of what's going on here. But he said, so soon as Mr. Knight, I had been sworn. Mr. Seymour proceeded to interrogate me as follows. Question, did the prisoner Joseph Smith Jr. cast the devil out of you? Answer, no, sir. Question, why have not you had the devil cast out of you? Answer, yes, sir. Question, and had not Joseph Smith some hand in it being done? Answer, yes, sir. Question, and did not he cast him out of you? And here's where you see Newell's personality. No, sir. It was done by the power of God, and Joseph Smith was the instrument in the hands of God on this occasion. He commanded him out of me in the name of Jesus Christ. And that kind of stopped the constable a little bit. And he said, are you sure that it was the devil? And Newell said, yes, sir. Did you see him after he was cast out of you? Yes, sir, I saw him. And what did he look like? And then it says here, one of my lawyers informed the witness that he need not answer the question on the part of the defendant. I didn't need to answer it. But he said, I believe I need not answer your last question, but I will do so, provided I be allowed to ask you a question first, and you answer it. Mr. Seymour, do you understand the things of the Spirit? No, answered Mr. Seymour, I do not pretend to such big things. Well then, replied Mr. Knight, or I replied, it will be of no use to tell you what the devil looked like, for it was a spiritual sight and spiritually discerned. And of course you would not understand it were I to tell you of it. So we kind of see that little spunkiness of him. I could tell you, but you're not going to understand. You're not going to know because you don't have that spirit with you. So I love that when he talked about that in the court trial, and that he had the nerve to stand up and testify that way. Okay, anybody else have a favorite story or a part to share from the book?
I have something.
Okay, Gordon.
This has been a classic testimony that I have saved over the years, and may I just quickly read it?
Certainly.
Newel Knight, 1830, from his journal. I'm sure we've all, if you've studied Newell, you will have run across this. And I want to put it in a frame. And guess where I also saw it? I saw it at the Knight History, the Knight, Joseph Knight home in Colesville. The year 1830 is closing upon us. Great things transpired, too great for pen to paint. To reflect that the closing year has been one of which all future generations will date the rise and organization of the Church of God upon the earth, no more to be thrown down, and to know that I have witnessed the important events with my natural eyes, and to know of a surety that the heavens have been opened to my view, that I have beheld the majesty on high, and heard the voice of my Redeemer, which has spoken words of comfort and instruction to me. Fill my whole being with gratitude to my Heavenly Father, while I write these things which are verily true. And I write them that my posterity and future generations may know of them, and that I may leave a faithful testimony of the things which I do know to be verily true. And may the Lord bless me with a wise and understanding heart, that I may ever do his will and help to establish his great purpose upon the earth is the greatest desire of my heart. Couldn't have been said better.
I love that. Now, for you who have the book, that is on page 31. And I have that highlighted and underlined because I love that testimony. He knew that what he was involved in, so many times I've wondered, they went through so much and so many people started finding the negative and finding the bad and finding fault with everything that was going on. How did the Knights stay so valiant? Because that's the legacy that they've left for us. And that's what I found from this testimony and many other times throughout this book. He testified, we know it's true, and we have to stay true to that. And so I love that. I love his testimony, but that is one of my very favorite parts of this book is that page. And every time I read it, I have a hard time getting through it because I am so grateful for him for leaving us that. How many of you loved his story of meeting Lydia? Come on, raise your hands. I know everyone loved that part. I loved how he put it, and just because you could just see him. He was this big, tough guy that was always trying to build the mills, and yet how he put meeting Lydia. And I have to turn to that because it's just so funny. It cracked me up as I was putting it. Because he had just talked about, on page 75, he had just talked about Sally's death, and he was a little bit shaken from that. And he had just said, she died, how sad he was because of that event. And then he went to Kirtland and he met Lydia there. And he starts on page 77 where he kind of talks about her and kind of his feelings towards her and how he hummed and hawed around trying to decide if he should even talk to her because he really liked her, but he wasn't sure if she felt the same way, although he had his suspicions. And so I just love that story when he talks about her and he says, so I'm starting on page 77 where he talks about it. And he says, sometime the forepart of the month of October, a woman by the name of Lydia Goldthwaite came to live at Brother Hiram Smith's, where I was boarding. She had not been long in the family when I found there was a growing attachment in my bosom towards her, which I in vain strove to cover up. She was very reserved in her manners, while prudence and wisdom seemed to mark her course in all her movements. Seldom did I hear her speak unless it was to Sister Smith concerning the affair she was engaged in. Yet I could now and then see the crimson dint upon her cheek, as she would occasionally, as she supposed unperceivably, cast her eyes towards me. That Cupid's darts had found its way to her heart, yet it appeared that she did not intend to let anyone perceive it. I love it. He's just so, you can just see this big guy going, Cupid's heart, Cupid's arrow. Ah. So I thought that was just way cute. And then he just keeps going on talking about, and this, he goes into more detail about his meeting Lydia than any other event in his book. And I thought that was really cute how he did that. And then how he kept looking for an opportunity to talk to her, and he finally found one. And then he said, I took her by the hand, and after a few words with her, I told her I thought her situation, as well as mine, was rather lonely. And if it was agreeable to her, perhaps we might be some company for each other. And that's just really cute how you need to see him going, excuse me, can we like hang out? So it was just really cute how he put that. And then as he talks about, you know, they wanted to do what was right, and they asked Hiram to go and talk to the prophet and see what he thought. And then they had asked Hiram to actually arrange the marriage. So that all happened on about they asked Hiram to kind of intervene for him. That was like on a Sunday. He came back that same day and said, yep, the prophet said, you're good to get married. Now, for those who don't know the story of Lydia, Lydia had been married before, and that's where she got the Bailey. She had 2 children that had both passed away. Her husband had been very abusive and ended up leaving her. And so she, it sounds like a lot of people, can you still hear me? Okay, I'm not sure what happened. But anyway, so Lydia had come from that situation. She had been married, but it had never been resolved legally. And although it had been about 5 years, and so she was hesitant to really form this relationship with Newell. They went to Joseph on Sunday afternoon. Joseph said, yep, it's good. It's been more than 5 years, so legally everything is good. They talked to Hiram to arrange the marriage for Tuesday, and they were actually married, I believe, on that Monday night, the next day, but within 48 hours from start to finish, they were married. So that's kind of a fun thing to know with Newell there, that when he felt the promptings, he acted on them and he didn't wait, and he did it. So that's kind of a fun story. There were a few other stories in here that I had never heard of before. He talks about...
Excuse me, can I add one thing back to Newell's thing?
Oh, yes.
That was the prophet's first wedding. It's the first one that he ever performed. I think most people know that, but it's still, I think it's worth mentioning.
It was, Jim. Thanks so much for reminding us of that. Because that was the first wedding. And in fact, I know they were all hesitant. If you continue reading here, they were all hesitant to have the prophet marry them because they didn't think it would be legal. And he assured them that as an ambassador, in fact, they actually asked him to go and get a certificate from the state saying that he could legally marry them. And he said, I can. And that was the first wedding that the prophet performed as well.
Yeah. They also found out later on that Mr. Bailey had died prior to that.
Yes, he did. That but they didn't know that at the time. They didn't find it out until later. And I think Newell, I didn't see it mentioned in here, but I know it's in the family stories somewhere. There was a paper written on it, and it might have actually be in Lydias History. Correct me, James, I know you're more of an expert on Lydia, but correct me if I'm wrong there. But I believe it was in Lydia's history that she talked about that later on they did learn that her first husband had died before their wedding, and it was just more of a testimony to them that the prophet did know what that this was meant to be.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So those are kind of some of the fun stories. One, I loved that he talked about, I always wondered, and I shared this with a couple of people as I talked, I always wondered why we didn't hear much about the Knights being driven out of Missouri and all of that going on, and when there was so much turmoil happening in Jackson County and everything, why we didn't hear a lot about that. And Newell cleared a lot of that up for us. And I thought it was interesting at the time when the Saints were being driven out of the state, they tended to leave Newell alone because he had a contract with the government to build a mill for them. And they wanted him to finish that mill before they drove him out. And so they kind of left him alone a little bit so that he could finish that mill, although he was part of it. I also thought it was very interesting that when everything was happening in Clay County, Joseph had actually been moved, Joseph Sr. had been moved to far west. So he was not involved in all of the persecutions that were happening in Clay County. Newell finally was able to finish the mill that he was building in Clay County and went to far west as well. And I caught a little bit in here that it sounded like Newell's house or Newell's yard may have been on the outskirts of far west, because he talks about all of the soldiers gathering at his home when they were getting ready to stand against the mob during the war, the Battle of Far West. And he talked about them all coming to his home and gathering in his yard. And that seemed to be the gathering place. But I thought it was interesting at the time when that Battle of Far West took place, Joseph Knight Sr. was no longer in Far West. He had actually moved back to Clay County. So during all of these conflicts that were happening, Joseph Knight Sr. had been following inspiration and was not involved in a lot of them. He had left the main area where the battles were taking place, where all of these persecutions were happening and homes were getting burned. It just felt like he was one step ahead of the game through a lot of that. And then when all of the Saints were driven out of Missouri, because of this government contract that Newell had to build this mill for the government, as soon as he finished it, they paid him for that. And he actually used that money to move Lydia and his family out of Clay County up to Illinois. So they were there before all of the Saints were driven out. They had already moved up to Illinois and kind of, again, ahead of all of the Saints being driven out. And so they were in Illinois, and then Newell went back to help move some of the other families out of Missouri and up to Illinois, but he already had Lydia there and established at the time. So she was not part of when we hear those horrific stories of the Saints being driven out. I'm sorry, when we hear them being driven out in the middle of the winter and leaving bloody footprints on the snow. How grateful I am that because of the government contract that he had enough money that he could move the family before all of that. So they didn't have to endure that intense persecution that a lot of the Saints did. The other thing that I noticed is that Newell seemed to be like a lot of us. He had his ups and downs. He was either very prosperous or very dirt poor. And he wasn't afraid to tell you when he didn't have enough money to even feed his family. And he shared some of those with us of him going out and praying and saying, help me. I can't do it. I don't even have enough provisions to provide my family with a meal tonight. Please help me. And something always happened where he was able to get enough to feed his family, or he would feel he didn't have good enough help to continue building his mill. I read that in a couple of them. And all of a sudden someone would come along, or he didn't have the resources, and then someone would come along and offer to partner with him to be able to build a mill. And so I love that he always relied on the Lord for everything. And he wasn't afraid to tell us that. I don't have enough for my family. So I went out behind the barn and I prayed, and I came back and someone showed up with some flour. He shared that a few times, especially in the early days, right after they had been driven out and they were trying to build Nauvoo. And he was also trying to get a mill up and running, and he was sick at the time. And he shared that many times. So I thought that was interesting. One thing I had never heard about was when they were in Clay County and he was trying to build the mill, he talks about dropping the axe on his foot and splitting his foot open for several months. And he knew that he needed to be there or the mill wouldn't continue to get built. And so he asked for a bed to be brought, and he laid on the bed and directed all of the work of building the mill from the bed while his foot was healing. So I love some of those stories that he's so human. I think we keep him up on a pedestal way up here because he's so amazing, and they went through so much, and yet it was kind of fun to see he's human. And he dropped an axe on his foot. And one other point, he talks about an injury that he had where he dislocated something or other and couldn't work for several months. And I thought, for us, we have injuries and we run to the emergency room and tell them to take care of us, and then we're back going, but they didn't have that luxury. And so he asked for a bed and said, I can do it all from here.
Edie, can I share one of my favorite stories from the Missouri period?
Yes, please do, Diane.
Page 103 in the book, and you have to kind of read between the lines, but it makes me smile. It says that April 15th, he wrote in his journal, Brother Brigham Young came before sunrise, I thought before sunrise, to my house and said he knew of no other that would suit him for the printing press so well. And if it would suit me, he would have me accommodate them with it. In other words, Brigham wants Newell to walk away from his new house. They've only been there 6 weeks. And he said, immediately I moved out and commenced to build another. Now, what he doesn't say is, oh, by the way, my wife is 8.5 months pregnant, and we have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and we just barely got in this house and moved to Caldwell County. But sure, take the house. That'll be just fine. And I thought, this is just astonishing to me, because if my husband had given away my house when I was 8.5 months pregnant, this would be an alarming thing in our marriage. But he says, by the 24th of April, my house was up and covered in, and I moved into it. The 29th of April, my wife gave birth to a son, James Philander Knight. And I now had to prepare for a garden, and all I could do in a few days, for I engaged to build for a man by the name of Brown in Clay County. So they just rolled with it. They gave their house to the printing press. He built a new one, and she had a baby, and then that's okay, and I'll be off to work. Thanks, dear. Good luck. I thought, oh my.
I love that story too, Diane. In fact, I highlighted that. That was one of the stories I had never heard of before, that he had gone through all of this. He had just built this house and got it all finished. And then Brigham Young came and said, this is the perfect location for the printing press. Can we have your house? And he said, sure. And I'm not sure how much notice he gave Lydia, but she seemed to go with it as well. We don't have much by way of her side of this story, but you are absolutely right. He gave it up and they moved out, and just a few days later she had her second child at that point. And so that is one of those fun ones. And he had just moved to Far West. He was one of the last ones to move there, just got his house all built, all settled, and then he turned it over to be used for the printing press. So
Lydia doesn't even mention it in her history. When she dictated her history, there's no mention of the episode. So apparently it was not a big deal to her either.
Yeah, I had never heard this story, and you're right. It is one little paragraph, and that's all he talks about in the book of that. I'm like, okay, how did you do that? How did you just say, sure? So that was me. And if you turn it over just to page 105, I loved the story of page 105 as I read about it. So this is kind of the second paragraph down. This is where he's kind of talking about the Battle of of Far West and everything that happened. But he said, crops looked delightful and promised the laborer an abundant reward for all his toil. But our enemies did not long behold our prosperity until they began to covet our homes and to devise and lay plans for our destruction. But so careful were we of violating any law or giving them any advantage over us that they could get no pretext by law against us. Their only alternative was to let us alone and let us enjoy our rights and freeborn Americans, or drive us en masse from the state. The latter they at length resolved to do. Sometime in August, the inhabitants of the adjoining counties began to hold meetings and to adopt measures for the accomplishment of this cruel and bloody design. And I loved it as I read that. I wrote in the margins along there, it just reminds me, and I apologize for anybody who is not members of the Church of Jesus Christ at this point, but it reminds me of the story in the Book of Mormon, where we hear about that all the time. The Nephites would be driven out, they would plant their crops, they would build their house, they would prosper, and then the Lamanites would come along and try to drive them out, go to war, wanted to take it over. And we kind of see that happening. And that's exactly what that reminded me of as he talked about this. They saw our crops, that they were good. They saw our houses, they saw our industry, and they wanted it. And so they started trying to find a way to take it away from us. And how he talked about that the saints were so careful not to violate any laws, not to give them any reason to want to be able to drive them out of the state. And then just a few pages later, as they're talking about when they actually did get driven out of the state, and the trial in Richmond, as the prophet is being tried in Richmond and then eventually taken to Liberty Jail. And I love that it talks about that for 3 days, they tried to come up with something against the prophet. And they couldn't, and so then they turned him over to other authorities and said, oh, well, maybe this will work. Oh, no, that wasn't breaking the law. Oh, well, maybe this was. And it just reminded me again of the story of Abinadi. And I happened to read this again at the same time we were studying the story of Abinadi in Come Follow Me. And I was just so struck of how very, very similar it was, in that for 3 days, the priests tried to come up with something to convict Abinadi so that they could put him to death, and they couldn't. And the same thing happened right before the trial, before he was put in Liberty Jail. That they held a trial at Richmond, and they tried to find something against the prophet to be able to imprison him, and they couldn't. So they turned him over to other authorities to try to come up with something. And so that story starts on page 113 of the whole trial and everything that happened in Clay County. And just before that, I have, as they came to Far West and arrested the prophet, and he talked about all of that, and he said, they conveyed the prophet to Independence. And I don't know if any of you caught this, but I love this little nugget that was in here. They conveyed him to Independence, Jackson County, the seat of mobocracy in the former persecution. This gave our beloved prophet an opportunity of walking upon the land consecrated and dedicated for the building of the temple, even the spot of the New Jerusalem, which shall be built preparatory to the coming of the Son of Man, and this that his own prophecy might be fulfilled. The design of the enemy no doubt was to destroy these men when they arrived at that place, but the Lord did not suffer it, for their work was not yet finished. And he found that blessing in disguise, that the prophet had been arrested. He was taken to Independence first, but it gave him that last opportunity to walk where the temple was supposed to be built and where he was trying to establish Zion. And I love that they found those blessings in disguise amid all of the hardships that they were going through, that they found a blessing in that the prophet could walk on the temple land one more time. So just a fun little nugget there. He talks a lot about being on the High Council and things that had to happen, and during the time of apostasy when so many people were leaving the church. And I'm kind of skipping forward to the Nauvoo era. we've kind of moved through, and I'm in the Nauvoo era. And on page 139, he talks a lot about what happened and some of the things that they went through. But this is where he really gives us another glimpse and another testimony of what he knew and why it was all worth it. And he just said, I'm starting about halfway down. He says, my object is that the rising generation and those that are far off may know in a future day what it has cost to establish and lay the foundation of this kingdom upon the earth in these the latter days, of the power of the Gentiles upon the earth. For the Lord will in his own time come out of his hiding place, and so great will be the distress of the nations that to those that know not the sufferings that they have caused and wantonly suffered to come upon the innocent, they would almost be ready to call upon God to stay the hand of distress and no mercy to the people. Therefore, I deem it important that all people have an opportunity to understand and know the truth of all that is now passing, and of the sufferings of the saints and the cost of the establishment of this kingdom. And just another thing that he talks about, you know, he never complained per se. You don't ever get that feeling of him complaining, but he just stated a lot of facts. They were not nice to us, and they're gonna feel it someday, and just kind of moves on. But I love as he talks about that was the cost to establish Zion, and he was very low and having a hard time with so many people who profess to be friends to the prophet and then turning against him. And that's kind of at that point. And then he talks about right after that. And this, when you have some low points, this is a great place to read here. But he said, he's talking about all this that happened in the High Council and all of these trials that they've had to have, all these disciplinary actions that they've had to have while they have been, so many people were leaving the church. And then he said, but to return to myself, it seemed as if after the Lord had suffered me to be brought low and in a state of privation and trial, and saw that I did not curse God, but that I still trusted in him, he wrought out a way for my deliverance. For in my deepest trials, I had not forgotten to confess the hand of God in all things, and still to trust in him. And day by day did I go into my mill, and there in secret ask for the blessings of God to attend me and to bear me off victorious over every trial that I should be suffered to come upon. The only cow I had strayed away, and I never found her. This left our little children and selves yet more destitute, for I had not the means to buy another, and it deprived us of a great comfort, as milk we got from her was a great help to our living. And I thought, here he is at the low point, nothing's happening. He's talking about that he goes in and petitions the Lord, and then he goes, oh, and by the way, our cow took off. We don't even have milk anymore. And so I just think it's hard for me to understand what they had to go through, because we don't have that. First off, I don't have a cow, and if it's straight, I just run to the store and buy milk. I can't even begin to understand what they had to go through. But we kind of see his feelings of this. One thing that I caught in this book, and it has made me so appreciative of Gordon and of your brother Daryl, is Newell was so adamant that the family be organized. And he talks about that over and over and over again. Once they got to Nauvoo and they learned that family should be organized, Newell said he had every desire, and he talks about it several times, he had every desire that the family be organized and that they look out for each other, and the rest of the family really didn't want to participate in that. But he talked about how important it was that that they become organized and that they gather together as a family and strengthen and support each other. And in fact, at one point he talks about that Joseph Jr. had moved out of Nauvoo and was living in a place, I think it's called Layard. I couldn't figure out how to pronounce it, but he was living there and he got very sick, and his wife Betsy came to petition Newell to see, and Newell at the time said he needs to move back to Nauvoo so that we as a family can be organized and take care of him. And he said, until he does that, he's not gonna get any better. and Betsy went back to Joseph Jr. and told him, this is what they said. And it took him a while, but Joseph finally moved back to Nauvoo. And Newell talked about how as soon as he moved back to Nauvoo, he started recovering, and how that family organization and family support was so important. And I think that's what we're all trying to do here, why some of us have become so passionate about keeping the family together and making sure that these reunions happen in spite of COVID-19 or in spite of whatever else is going on, because we strengthen each other just by being together. And I look at my screen and I see all these faces here and I think we're all in this together. And what a strength and a support we have from all of, not just our immediate family, but all of our cousins and long distance cousins and everything else. That's what it's all about. And we, by coming together in this family organization, we're fulfilling Newell's greatest wish, which was to have the family organized and to strengthen and support each other. And so I'm appreciative of everyone that started this. I know Gordon was one of the founders of this, getting this all started, and how appreciative I am for their vision of keeping Newell's dream alive, of keeping the family organized. So anybody else have anything? We have about 5 more minutes if anyone else wants to share a fun story, something cool that you learned from the book, or just maybe a story that you have that you thought would be included in the book and wasn't.
Hey, may I say one thing?
Oh, please, go ahead, Jim.
I'd like to just tell you that about 35 years ago, I went to the church history and requested a copy of Newell's Journal, which they told me they would absolutely could not have. I didn't believe them. So I kept hounding them. And finally, they gave me a microfilm copy of the original that they had in their possession. But before that, I had to sign a document stating that I would not quote from it. I would not give copies to anyone except my children on down, but that I was not allowed to do anything with it. It is such a blessing to have this out where we can all read it and see it. I am just so grateful for the church allowing these things to come forth, that all of the family can get copies, can read it, can see it, and see the rich heritage that we have. We are so blessed.
We are. And we have it just at our fingertips, and it's just full of nuggets. Every time we read it, there's more that we can pull out of it. Fun stories that he tells in his cute little way of, as I was just reading again, as he talks about everything that's happening in Nauvoo, and I read this and it just cracked me up. But here's what he says as they're getting ready to leave, and this is on page 157. While I write, my hand and heart trembling at the picture or reality of the acts of men who are made in the likeness of God. This is after the prophet has been murdered, and he had a chance to go back to Carthage about 1.5 years later. After he was martyred, he had a chance to go visit Carthage, and he could see the blood was still there, and he was able to see that. And this is what he writes after visiting Carthage. While I write, my hand and heart trembling at the picture of reality of the acts of men who are made in the likeness of God and ought to be noble and like him in their motives, almost forbids and quite makes me blush to record their acts. So violent have been the works, and so little heed has government paid to our cries and petitions for redress of our wrongs, that the only way possible for us to check the flame and stay the hand of persecution, and thereby save the lives of the innocent babe, the sprightly youth, together with the middle-aged and the silver-headed veteran who once fought with a Washington to plant the standard of freedom and spread the banner of liberty in this glorious land. I say the only possible means checking the fury of this nation has been to sign a decree that the people called Latter-day Saints in mass leave their boasted land of liberty, that they neither sow nor reap again upon their possession. O Columbia, O boasted land of America, how hath thy glory faded, thy honor fled? How will the nations afar off reproach thee, when thy foul deeds in gore, written in letters of blood, go forth, for they cannot be concealed? The widow's cry and orphan's grief will burst every land and uncover every act, that thy works may appear naked in the eyes of all nations. But those whom thou now persecutest and drivest out from thee, and altogether despiseth, and hath refused them an asylum or one cheering hope of justice, shall yet rise in majesty and glory, and shine forth glorious and powerful as the sun, when thy glory hath departed. So, I love it. Amid everything, they had just been told they had to leave Nauvoo, and they needed to leave immediately. This was in September, and they'd been told they were not allowed to plant any more crops or do anything. They had to leave. And he's saying, oh, Columbia, oh, America, we fought for you, and now you're driving us out. But we will shine forth. You may drive us out, but you're not going to get us down or weigh us down or stop the work from moving forward. So that's my take on the book. Thank you for coming and sharing this with us. And if anybody else has anything, feel free to share.